Hi, I'm Martha Croft, and I'm a professor in the Department of Political Science, and I am the lucky one who gets to introduce our speaker of the evening. I'm standing in tonight for Dr. Weeks, Dr. Greg Weeks, our chair, who during this lovely spring break has chosen to go to a conference in Colombia. At a beach where I'm sure he's not spending any time. He's just being scholarly. I am also the director of the Public Policy PhD program here at UNC Charlotte, so which is a lot of fun. So I'm actually the interim, so I'm the interim introducer and the interim director. I am just as interim as we can get, but I want to welcome everyone tonight. And I want to tell you that this is the last personally speaking of the year. Dean Gutierrez will come up later and she will tell you about next year's lineup of speakers. I hear it's great, and I, for one, plan to be at many of them, but tonight is great. With this focus on voting in elections and everything that's been going on, it's also really important to realize that you guys all have a choice that you'll be making. And I've been asked to read a statement that with only 5 days away, we have an election and early voting until Saturday. And we want to remind everyone about the Connect NC bond on the March 15th ballot. The $2 billion dollar bond includes $1.3 billion for higher education, including $90 million for a new science building. That's a new science building for UNC Charlotte. So it's important to keep in mind, according to the statement, and I'm totally sincere about this, that North Carolina's grown by a lot. There are grown by about 2 million people since the last bond in the year 2000. And UNC Charlotte has actually grown by 76% since that time. So that's big. But remember to vote. You can vote early through Saturday, and the election day is Tuesday. So talk to Eric about it. He's an expert. I also want to thank, we have a couple of undergraduates that were here tonight helping out. Anthony Johnson is a senior in political science, and Joseph Franklin is an undergraduate, but in the accelerated master's program for chemistry. These two students are two students of tonight's speaker, part of a program that Eric, Dr. Heberlig, has been directing for a long time, the North Carolina Student Legislature. And with this opportunity, students get to write policy briefs and learn information and actually see what it's like to try and pass legislation. I'm hoping they're not quite as polarized as our current Congress and maybe a few of the Tea Partiers, but we'll see. So I also want to tell you that the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences advances discovery, dissemination, and application of knowledge and creativity in the traditional areas of liberal arts and sciences, and we try to build academic programs for tomorrow. We regard this event, this personally speaking event, where our scholars that are here, our very well-renowned scholars that are here at UNC Charlotte can tell you about their research. Personally Speaking is it's a great program sponsored by our library and by the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. So tonight's speaker is really going to tell you about some important work, research that he's done. And Dr. Heberlig is a person that takes that research out into the community more than most of us do, more than most political scientists do. He tries to educate the community, and I regard this event as an extension of that, and it's very important. I've known Dr. Heberlig for a long time. He's one of the reasons my husband, John, and I are here teaching in the political science department, because when we first came here, well, even before we came here, we knew people, and Eric was one of the people we met. And we met at a conference because he was doing research on outside communication on the ground, flyers, mailers, other campaign communications in North Carolina Senate races. and this was non-candidate communications, and he really helped to document what has become rather a disturbing trend and sort of culminated in recent Supreme Court cases, which he may or may not talk about. I'm not sure if he'll talk about. Yes, he will. And on a personal note, since this is personally speaking, he brought his wife, Tracy. Do you want to wave at everyone, Tracy? And he also has 3 children, one of which is the best friend of one of my son's best friends. And so it's great to have such good colleagues. But Eric is also a role model, and I'll just let you hear what he has to say. So, Eric?
Our topic for tonight is Congress, but I've discovered over the past 6 months or so that when the first words out of my mouth are Donald Trump, people are a whole lot more interested in what I have to say. So I'll be happy to talk about Donald Trump during question and answer at the end, or anything else about the presidential race. This is a quote with which we start the book. Senator Evan Bayh, who was retiring when he said this, so he had the freedom to be a bit more honest. The Congress is now a dues-paying organization. Junior members have to raise this much, committee chairs have to raise that much. Find that in a civics book. Well, what is the civics book? We describe the textbook Congress based on what Congress looked like in the 1950s, 1960s, when we first started documenting what Congress was like and writing textbooks about it. So I'm going to lay that out as our context, because my story is really how things have changed in important ways from this textbook Congress. Back then, committees had all the power. They wrote the legislation, they had the experts on various policy areas, and party leaders really didn't interfere with what committees were doing. They were very independent. You got to be chair of a committee through seniority. That is, you were on the committee longer than anybody else. It didn't matter your skill, your senility, or anything else. If you were there longer than everybody else, you were chair. That meant if committees had the power and you were chair, you had the power. You decided what bills got out of committee, what bills were blocked, what the content of those legislation was. Political parties did not play a terribly important role in financing elections. In fact, they worked very hard to try to come up with donor lists so they could bombard them with direct mail, urging them to make contributions to the parties. And they actually didn't raise very much because parties are kind of this abstract organization. People like to give to candidates. Candidates have personalities. People like them, they know their local member of Congress, they'll give to them, but giving to a national party is, it takes a special type of person to sacrifice their hard-earned money to something like a national party. And finally, from after World War II to 1994, the Democrats were the majority party in Congress, period, often by large amounts. And to be the majority party meant you had all the institutional leverage. You decided what bills came to the floor, what the content of them was. You decided who got the projects in their district, everything. So the minority party got the crumbs that the majority party allowed them to have. Majority party status is still important in that way. They still have all the powers, which is why it matters and why Washington changed substantially when Republicans won control of the House and Senate in the 1994 elections. This is where we first started figuring out that something was changing. This is our graph of the contributions of incumbent members of Congress to other candidates in their party or to the Democratic or Republican parties. If you go back further than this into the 70s and 80s, the graphs stay as low as they are in 1990 and 1992. That is, less than $500,000 every year was contributed by all 435 members of Congress to other candidates or to the parties. And then you see it shoot up dramatically. Majority stakes matters. After 94, either party could win control of the House in any election. That gave members more incentive to cooperate with one another in organizing their election campaigns, sharing resources with one another, so members in safe districts could help those in competitive districts that would help their party win majority status. Representative Charlie Gonzalez puts it this way: I have no problem understanding that my colleagues can't be with me in terms of voting on certain issues. But I want them to come back because they will be voting for the same person for Speaker. We have a majority in the committees. They empower me, so I have a vested interest in their success. That is, as long as we're the majority, my bills have a chance of passing. I get to be a committee chair or subcommittee chair. That empowers me and makes it easier for me to deliver the benefits I've promised to my constituents. It makes it easier for me to pass the legislation I've run to Congress to pass. So we know Congress is a legislative institution. That's Article 1 of the Constitution. What Bruce and I are arguing is that the legislative responsibilities of Congress are still there, but perhaps as important, or what has changed or risen in importance, is its function as a fundraising institution for the parties. That is, the parties now use the levers of power, of institutional and legislative power in Congress, as leverage to raise funds for their election campaigns. And we know individual members of Congress have always done this, but now it's an organized partisan effort to do so. One of the people that Bruce interviewed when he was doing his dissertation ended up being Speaker of the House, and she said, I want to be in the leadership. I mean the majority party, and the way to do that is to make sure we win enough races. So ordinarily we would think of that as a Freudian slip, or something that you would say and then realize that that wasn't the publicly acceptable answer and correct yourself. But Bruce and I think this is really the key to understanding what's going on, that individual ambition and the collective consequences for the parties are now merged, that the parties have figured out how to direct individual ambition in a way that benefits the party collectively. So, how do you get members of Congress to raise money on behalf of the party when they could spend their time doing other things, or could raise money merely for their own election campaigns, which is what they always did and didn't contribute to the parties? Well, you use the resources of the institution as incentives to give members something of benefit in exchange for the contributions they raise for the party. So committee chairmanships, prestige committee assignments, which are the committees such as the Ways and Means Committee that writes tax legislation, the Appropriations Committee, which doles out the money, Energy and Commerce Committee, which is the primary one for business regulation. They're all magnets for contributors because they have power over critical policies that affect the economy. So you put members on these committees who are the big fundraisers, then they can extract more money, use their fundraising skills to extract more money and kick it back to the party. And party leadership posts. We don't talk about this in the book. Actually, we just assert it. But this is evidence that Bruce and I have gathered since the book, looking at various measures of legislative effectiveness. So who's good at writing legislation, passing legislation, and so forth. And seeing, well, is that related to advancement in Congress in the same way that we document that these contributions are related to advancement in Congress? They're not. Money matters. Legislative skills actually do not help predict whether you advance in Congress or not. This is not a surprise to us because, again, traditionally it's been seniority that advances you, and people who have risen historically into party leadership positions aren't really people with much legislative experience. Being a party leader is like being a manager. You're coordinating lots of people, not actually getting down in the nitty-gritty of writing legislation. And the parties have used the whip system, which they've traditionally used to get information out about votes and to twist arms to get party members to vote on legislation. Now they use the whip system not just for whipping on votes, but they use it to whip to get members to raise money on behalf of the party. So they've used key elements of the legislative institution as part of a larger fundraising effort on behalf of the party. So, all right, it should be disconcerting that big fundraisers are rewarded with posts with institutional power. Is this simply an instance of people buying votes? That is, you raise money, we give you a position because you've paid us off. Well, we argue that's not exactly the way it works, because it's not merely the amount of money that you give, but it's how you allocate that money as a member of Congress that helps you advance. So who advances? In the majority party, we find that it's those who contribute to incumbents in competitive races. Incumbents in competitive races. So the logic of that is, if you're already the majority party, all you need to do to stay the majority is to win the seats you already have. So if you contribute to the other incumbents who are in trouble and they win, you've held your majority, you get to keep your positions of power and your greater ease in passing legislation. The minority party, however, those who advance, are those who give to challengers, candidates who are running against incumbents, because the minority party needs to pick up seats in order to become the majority. Okay? So in the time series of data that we have switches in majority party control in Congress. The Republicans are the majority for a while. The Democrats are in the majority for a while. But when majority control switches, who gets advanced and who gets rewarded switches. That is, there's not a Democratic or Republican way of doing this. It's a majority versus minority way of doing it. They reward the people who give to the right type of candidates, the candidates who help them either hold or maintain the majority. And both parties advance those who give money directly to the political party. Okay? And that's important because if you're giving money to the political party, the party then turns around and gives it to candidates in competitive races, but the recipient of that money doesn't know who originally gave the money. The money looks like it's coming from the party, not from the individual members of Congress who raised it. So the party is really rewarding those who provide money in a way that has collective benefits for the party, not just those who are raising money and giving it to their friends on their committee or to people in their states or people who might help them pass their own individual legislation. They're rewarding people who give it to candidates that will help them achieve a collective benefit, a collective goal for the party. All right, so as we saw in the first chart, we've seen a big increase in the amount of money that members of Congress give to other candidates and to the party. How do they pay for this? Well, we find that they turn primarily to what we call access-oriented donors. That is, people who want something from Congress. Corporate and trade political action committees, large individual contributors, and for Democrats, union political action committees. Okay? And the reason why this is important is because the members who are in the best position to take money and give it away are those who are in safe seats, who don't need the money for their own reelection. Well, why would you give money to someone who's going to win reelection without you giving them money? So for individual donors, there's not a whole lot of incentive to part with your hard-earned money to somebody who doesn't need it. But political action committees in Washington understand that committee chairs and so forth don't need the money to win re-election. They understand that the money's going to be given away to somebody else, but they want access to the chair or subcommittee chair because they need to talk about legislation and how, for example, banking reform might affect Bank of America, or electricity deregulation might affect Duke Energy. So they need to get their lobbyists in the door. They need to contribute regardless of whether the person they're giving the money to actually needs it for election purposes. So if you need to get more money, you lean on donors over whom you have leverage, over whom you can say, look, I'll have time for you, but I need to see some green. Okay? what members of Congress have also done is expanded their number of fundraising organizations. So I think the average citizen thinks, all right, you have your campaign committee and that's where all the money goes. Well, for most of history, that's been true. What we've seen, particularly over the last decade or so since this has started, has been an increase in the number of what we call leadership political action committees. So a member of Congress can form their own political action committees, just like Bank of America or the Sierra Club or any other organization can form a committee to donate money to politicians. So a member of Congress can form these political action committees, which then mean I can come to you and ask for a donation for my reelection committee, and then I can come back again and ask for another contribution for my political action committee. Okay? So if you need more money, because the party's asking for more of your money for its campaign, and finding new donors is hard work, now if I have a second committee, I can raise more money from the same people without the hard work of identifying new donors. They've also started utilizing what are called joint fundraising committees, which are committees that are joint operations. They have to raise money along with another candidate or along with a party organization, and they basically split the proceeds. Okay? So what's important for us is merely that, well, if you need more money, you create more avenues through which you can collect money, more routes to get the money from donors. All right. Our book ends in 2010 in terms of the data we collected. For those of you who follow politics closely, there's two events that have had a substantial influence on Congress that both occurred in 2010. One is the rise of the Tea Party, and the other is the Supreme Court's decision in Citizens United, which basically says corporations or any type of organization don't have to form political action committees in order to get money into politics. They can just buy their own advertising, and donors, whether they be rich or individuals or corporations, can basically give unlimited contributions to super PACs, which are just organizations that pool this money and buy advertising to say whatever they want in elections. So given the trends which we documented, having organizations spend unlimited amount of money could destabilize what Bruce and I documented. So in research we've done since the book, it's to try to figure out how these new flows of money have affected the trends we documented in the book. So this is non-party expenditures in congressional elections. You see in 2010 and 2012, somewhat of a jump in the amount of money that's spent by non-party organizations. So it's very low. You know, if you watch television ads in campaigns prior to 2010, you probably thought it was a lot of money being spent back then. Now it's many, many times more than that. So if you're an incumbent member of Congress and you're used to the outside spending that you saw in the 80s and 90s, you're used to dealing with that, but this amount of spending is very destabilizing. You're thinking about running your campaign. I need to raise X amount of money to have X amount of advertising, and now you have the possibility of super PACs or rich individuals swooping into your districts and buying ads in that quantity against you. What do you do in that situation? It creates a huge amount of uncertainty for members of Congress. So what effects have we seen? This is from a paper that a student and I just presented at the North Carolina Political Science Association meetings. Basically, we put it in dollar terms, but it's the percentage of total funds raised for reelection committees by people with leadership positions. So prestige committees, extended leadership position, committee chairs, and elected party leaders. And basically what you see is that the trend goes rapidly up in 2010 and 2012, which means that people with leadership positions in Congress are taking up much more higher percentage of the total fundraising that's taken place. That is, the candidates who, quote unquote, need the money are those, of course, in competitive elections, but it's the leaders that are taking it. Why is that? Well, there's been a surge in incumbent fundraising of all type. So if there's going to be all this outside money spent in your district, what do you do about it? Well, the most obvious thing is you raise more money regardless of how you can go about doing that. We also see a decline in the amount of sharing, that is giving away your campaign money to other candidates and to the parties, starting in 2010. So you raise more and hoard more of what you raise. You give less of it away. Party leaders, as I just showed you in the last chart, are raising more money to cover the decrease in redistribution of funds by everybody else. So the party still has enough to fund its competitive candidates. And we see an increase in contributions from members of Congress to safe incumbents. Okay, that is, they're giving less of the money they give away to people in competitive races and more to people that I would objectively say don't need the money. But what has changed is if that amount of money can flow into your district, what is objectively safe is not what we thought it is. You're always running scared. You always think somebody could get ticked off at a vote I take and swoop in and dump millions of dollars in ads in my district. So I need it, even though in the last election I won easily. And you've heard about super PACs, I suspect, these organizations that can raise unlimited amounts of money and spend as much as they want in these districts. In 2012, Bruce and I went through all the super PACs that spent on advertising in congressional elections. And the expectation, I think, of many people was that super PACs would be a great thing for non-incumbent candidates. They'd go in and they'd nuke these incumbents and we'd have huge turnover in Congress. What we found was that 72% of PACs spent money on a single contest. That is, they don't operate like traditional PACs did, which was raise money and then dole it out to many candidates across the country. They're raising huge amounts of money and spending it in one single district. And many of these super PACs are spending it on behalf of incumbents. They're either spending it on pro-incumbent ads or they're spending it on ads attacking the challenger of the incumbent. In other words, even though super PACs legally must be independent of the incumbent and may not legally coordinate their activities with the incumbent, as we've seen in the presidential race, many of the presidential candidates raising money for super PACs until the very moment they declare that they're going to run for president. Politicians will find a way to route the money in ways that is advantageous to themselves. So most of these super PACs are not really independent entities. They're really aligned with a candidate. They're really a candidate finding his or her sugar daddy to run ads on their behalf. So what does all this mean for representation? Well, there's only 24 hours in a day for all of us, including the president and members of Congress. So any amount of time you increase your fundraising, the less time you have to meet with constituents or to do legislating. Members of Congress that we interviewed said that most members of Congress now spend between 1/4 and 1/3 of their time on the phone dialing for dollars. That's 1/3 of their time that they're not writing and debating legislation. Well, if you have to raise money, you're raising money from mainly interest groups or large donors. You're spending your time at events with those type of people. You're not spending a whole lot of time meeting with people or hearing the concerns of people who are unorganized, okay? Which is, well, most of us are linked into the interest group system in some way through professional organizations or civic organizations. But for voices that don't overlap with what organized interest groups are telling members of Congress, your voice is less amplified, shall we say, in this type of system. So that's my cartoon here. the lobbyist telling the member of Congress, pay no attention to the man outside, who is the voter. And the other main source of money, other than the interest groups, are individual donors. We think, well, that's wonderful, that's the way it should be. Individual donors have lots of civic virtue, and they have this power to the people. Anybody know what type of, or how individual donors differ from the average voter? Well, I'm lapsing into class, sorry. You guys don't have microphones. So I'll just assert it. Individual donors tend to be much more ideologically extreme than the average citizen or average voter. There's some type of cause that they feel strongly enough about that they're willing to part with hundreds or thousands of dollars to give to a politician. So I'm going to show two graphs. These aren't from the books. These are graphs that my political science colleagues are probably familiar with, but most of you know that Congress is polarized, but probably haven't seen it demonstrated this way. These are the average party scores in terms of their ideology, whether they're liberal and conservative, going back into the 1940s. So you see the gap widening and widening over time. The red line is the Republicans going up, shifting in a more conservative direction, the Democrats gliding down in a more liberal direction. And this is another way of illustrating the same thing. In the early 1970s, this is using the same scores, but graphing the number of members of Congress who score in each quartile of the scores. So the blue are the Democrats, the red are the Republicans, and you do see two bumps there. The average Democrat votes more liberally than the average Republican, but you see some purple in the middle. That's where there's overlap in voting behavior between the Republican and Democratic Party. Okay, so that's the early 1970s. Now we skip to 2009, 2010. We see a substantial gulf between the two parties, and we see no purple. Starting in 2000, there has not been a Democrat that votes more conservatively than any Republican in the House or Senate, or a Republican that votes more liberally than any Democrat in the House and the Senate. So there's literally is polarization. They have moved to the polls in terms of their voting behavior. Each party is coherent in terms of its ideology in Congress, and that's why campaigns seem a whole lot more angry, divided today than they used to be, because the constituencies to which they're speaking are a lot more divided than they used to be. Okay? In part, that's driven by the demands of ideologically extreme donors to whom they must go to get money. Congress has never been very popular. This is the job approval ratings for Congress. You see those have come down even further as Congress has polarized and put more emphasis on fundraising. I think it was in 2010 when I taught my Congress class, I found a poll that found that Hugo Chavez, who at the time was the dictator of Venezuela, was more popular in the United States than Congress. Vladimir Putin, who you all still know, was more popular in the United States than Congress. So, as a representative democracy, for whom Congress is the representative institution, for it to be less popular than tin pot dictators is a real problem for how our democracy works and for public ability to engage in the process of self-governance. Our argument is that this polarization and fundraising chase that exacerbates the polarization is part of this decline in the public attitudes towards Congress, and therefore a real concern for the ongoing sustainability of our democratic project. I'm happy to take questions, but I'm told you're not allowed to ask questions until you have a microphone. So ask our volunteers to get the microphones and pass them out.
Seems an obvious question. What's the spike of 84% in '02?
9/11. It's a rally round the flag effect. When there are disasters, when there are beginnings of wars, people rally around the government, and then their confidence in the government dissipates over time as we get away from the immediate crisis.
With the research that you and your colleague have gone since 2010, how do you see this trend of money, of wealth in legislation continue from now, say in the next 10 years? How influential is it going to be?
I don't think it'll get any different. I mean, the dynamics that are driving the money chase aren't going to change. That is, candidates need money for television ads. Television ads are the biggest expense of their campaign. I doubt television is going to get less expensive over time. The other main use of the money is for paying campaign staff, and a lot of it is for consultants who will tell you that you need to spend more on TV advertisements, which then they take a cut of. So it becomes a self-fulfilling cycle. As long as, the government does things that affect people, which is always going to do, people are going to be affected and therefore want to affect what government does about that and are going to put their money into the system to show how intensely they feel about it and to try to influence what goes on. I think that the question for Bruce and me was, is the system where the parties use the institutional leverage of Congress to extract money and using the leadership positions as the means to do that, is that likely to continue? I think yes. But the key change that we've seen is the rise of the Tea Party. As you may know about the Tea Party, they're an uncompromising breed of politician. They're not terribly interested in gaining leadership positions and gaining power in Congress. So what we've seen Tea Party members do is not engage in this type of fundraising on behalf of other candidates and the parties as much as more traditional candidates are doing. So that's one limitation on it. I think the second limitation would be is if one party gains a dominant majority and thus there's no battle for majority status anymore, and members of Congress go back to what they were doing prior to 1994, which was merely fending for themselves and thinking if Congress isn't going to turn over, me giving money to somebody else isn't going to empower me, it's just giving my money away, okay? So if that becomes the situation, then this, I think, dissipates. Probably we see what Bruce and I have documented since Citizens United is that then the party leaders would take on a larger and larger share of the responsibility and more of your rank and file members will hoard more of their money as they used to do prior to the Republican takeover of Congress in the 1990s.
I have two questions. One of them is yes or no, and that is you've shown a
Oh
change.
yeah, I can do a longer answer than that.
So I'll ask the yes or no first. You've shown a change in the behavior of politicians raising money for their parties in Congress. And the yes or no question is, does the same change in behavior also apply to state legislatures?
Yes.
Okay.
And here's the longer answer. They were the model for doing this in some states before Congress. California, Ohio, you may remember Jim Black in North Carolina. North Carolina didn't start this, but this is exactly what got Jim Black in trouble. He wasn't raising the money for himself. He was trying to figure out new ways of raising the money for his party in the General Assembly, and figuring out how to keep the Democrats in the majority.
The second question is, you showed in one of your first graphs that this change really began to happen in the mid-1990s or so. And so you've documented that the change has happened, but I don't remember you telling us really why you think the change has happened.
Well, it's the battle for majority status changed the incentives, that other people in my party winning now can make a difference in whether our party holds majority status or not. Whereas before, when the Democrats were way ahead and everybody expected them to be in the majority forever, whether I help somebody else in my party doesn't matter, because the Democrats are still going to be in the majority at the end of the day. The second element of it is that the parties instituted this as a strategy. They went out and started to mobilize their members to raise money on behalf of the parties, where they really hadn't before, because members would have rebelled against it, and started to use these institutional positions as the plum, the reward for members who did raise the money.
Eric, first of all, that's a great, I really enjoyed your presentation, and you certainly have provided a lot of corroborating of things that we've pondered. But my question is kind of bringing us into the presidential area that we're facing right now with money and ads. There seems to be some growing evidence that the vast amounts of money being poured into television ads is not as effective as it once was. And if that, in fact, we see that with Jeb Bush's campaign, we see it with Marco Rubio's campaign, if that, in fact, ends up being the case, then all of this house of cards, in a sense, of basing the whole thing on saturating the airwaves with ads, if the ads don't work, then does the whole system come tumbling down? I mean, you and I are probably old enough to remember when newspapers used to have ads. Do you remember campaign ads? There used to be campaign ads. Look at the Charlotte Observer and try to find a campaign ad in the Charlotte Observer. There's none, because people say that people don't pay attention to newspapers anymore. Will there come a time when people say people don't pay attention to television ads anymore? And if so, what will that do to this whole system?
I don't think so. Arguably, much of the amount of money spent on ads doesn't matter, in the sense that it doesn't determine who wins. Money looks like it matters in determining election outcomes, because usually the person who spends the most wins, but that's usually because they have other advantages that correlate with money, such as incumbency status, name recognition, being in a district that is overwhelmingly one-sided for a particular party, so the money flows to the person who already has an advantage. Much of the money that is spent in competitive campaigns, I think, really cancels one another out, because both sides are spending similar amounts. As we will see again this fall in North Carolina, when we are competitive, we're going to be inundated with ads, and people kind of tune them out. It becomes a cacophony of noise. So, and the parties and candidates know this, but no one has an incentive to stop. Okay, because if you stop and the other side keeps spending, then you lose, because then voters are only hearing information from one side. So if you spend enough to cancel out what the other side is spending, then at least it's an even contest. And if your candidate loses, well, then it's not your fault, because you did what you could for them. It's, you know, they did something wrong in their campaign, or it was the national environment or the economy or something that's outside of your control. But what the parties and candidates can control is what they raise. The Bush and Rubio examples are good ones, in that I think people often forget that unlimited money, well, it's better to have it than not, but if you don't have a message that people are going to respond to, all that money is not really buying you anything. In fact, we find with self-funding candidates, that is, candidates who are rich and pay their own campaign bills and don't raise any money, tend not to win. Okay, Donald Trump doesn't look like, or he's a kind of a counterexample of this, but most of them are not like Donald Trump. Most of them don't win. And we think the reason for that is that the process of going to donors and persuading them to open their wallet and give you money is not unlike the process of going to voters and persuading them to vote for you. So if you don't have to create a message that will persuade a donor to give you money, you're probably not thinking very much about what your message would be to persuade a voter to cast their vote for you. So rich candidates tend not to do well because they never figure out what message is going to convince a voter who is not rich like them to vote for them. So the bottom line is I think the role of money in elections is often overstated for the reasons I just talked about.
You didn't really mention the effect of gerrymandering in districts and what it does. I recall a statistic in North Carolina that there were more people who voted Democrat than voted Republican, and yet it was like 10 districts Republican and 3 Democrat. Are there not areas that have bipartisan selections of the districts? How many states do that, and what's its effect on the political situations in those areas?
There are a handful of states, about 5, that have nonpartisan districting commissions. Those states do tend to have more competitive congressional races than states that allow the state legislature to do it. What we've found is that gerrymandered districts have less impact on this polarization that I've documented than I think most people expect. And I know that's hard to convince people in North Carolina just because we're one of the worst states for gerrymandering. But the underlying issue is that people increasingly reside near people who are like them economically, racially, politically. So when you're drawing geographic districts, it's actually harder and harder to draw a politically balanced district. Rural areas are increasingly Republican and conservative. Urban areas are increasingly urban and liberal. So the Democrats, or one of the Democrats' problems in terms of winning majorities in Congress, is that you have urban districts that are 80 and 90% Democratic, so you get huge Democratic majorities there, but those votes are wasted because they're not in districts that are kind of 45, 55 districts where those Democratic votes could flip the outcome. So North Carolina is very competitive at the presidential level, governor's level, senator's level, because the urban areas can offset the rural areas and vice versa. But in terms of the smaller state legislative and congressional districts, you know, they're either rural or suburban or urban, and it's hard to create a politically mixed district.
How do you explain someone like former Senator Jim DeMint of South Carolina, who apparently raised a lot of money when he was in the Senate for other candidates and seemed to be gaining a lot of attention and influence, and then he left the Senate, decided not to come back?
Being a senator stinks. Being a senator stinks. No, I tell my class, I don't know why anyone would want to be a senator other than that it's a cool title. I mean, the rules of the Senate make it almost impossible to get anything done. Most of you are probably aware of the filibuster, which allows for unlimited debate time. Filibusters used to be relatively rare. Now, the media covered them when they happened, which made them seem more frequent than they actually were. But now they're used all the time. And it's not just, or the Senate rules allow you not just to filibuster on legislation coming up for a final vote. It's any debatable motion can be filibustered. So any amendment can be filibustered. A motion to proceed can be filibustered, which is, of course, ironic because you can't proceed as long as someone's filibustering. And it takes 60 votes, 10 more than votes than you need to actually pass the legislation to get anything to move. So, and parties are increasingly using the filibuster as part of their legislative strategy. That is, they block everything to force the majority party to negotiate with them. They hold members who want to vote for final passage to vote against ending the filibuster, again, to preserve the party's leverage in extracting more concessions. So the Senate is basically at a standstill for everything. So most politicians, I truly believe, actually do want to achieve some type of policy goals. There's a reason they ran for office to do something, and they can't do it. Neither side can do it. Whereas in the House, being a member of the minority party is terribly frustrating because the majority won't let you do anything. But if you're in the majority party, you can get things done in the House. In the Senate, it doesn't matter whether you're in the majority or the minority. You're kind of stuck in the swamp of rules.
Eric, have we reached the point of no return as a nation in terms of how we deal with politics? We are not really a democracy anymore, are we?
No, we're a republic and always have been. But go ahead, ask.
Well, and the
ask
question is, with the unlikelihood of Citizens United ever to be retracted or campaign finance reform ever being enacted, where is the hope of our getting past this blueness and redness into more purple?
The voters. The money doesn't matter if voters choose something other than what the money interests are demanding. Money is only a resource to communicate to voters. And I think the polarized situation that we're stuck in at the moment, there are other periods in American history where there have been equal levels of polarization. I think why the polarization today seems so extreme is because we're moving from one of the rare instances in American history where the parties haven't been polarized. So it was actually the 50s and 60s that are the more unusual era of American history. So what changes things is kind of a shakeup in the voter coalitions of the parties. Now, usually these are caused by some type of social cataclysm, like the Great Depression. So what I commonly say is, yeah, we can get out of the situation, but the way to get there is probably worse than the current situation we're in. Now, I think the alternative to a cataclysm is Donald Trump, who may be a cataclysm on his own, but what we see is that he at least has the real potential of shaking up the coalitions that have been aligned with each of the parties over the last generation. And that, the hardcore conservatives are scared of Trump. The Republican donor base, the ones who are funding super PACs, are scared of Trump because he's not interested in turning Social Security into private investments. He's interested in putting more protections on free trade. He's not interested in, or he's interested in a big military, but not sending it off on, foreign adventures. So those are core elements of the Republican catechism over the last generation that he's not, and he's certainly not emphasizing social issues like abortion and homosexuality that is, the primary concern of evangelical Republicans. So Republicans don't know what to do with him, other than a desire to get rid of him. Democrats are happy to have him, but on the other hand, fear that he's going to steal a lot of the working class voters that have voted for them since the New Deal in the 1930s. So how this all plays out, of course, is uncertain. But if you don't have a party anymore that really represents the desires of corporate America, well, what do? They're going to find some way of influencing the system. And if they don't have a Republican Party, well, do they form a third party? I think that the most likely outcome of this election is if Trump's the Republican nominee, the Republican establishment funds a third party candidate to run against him. If he's not the Republican nominee, he's the independent candidate to run against the Republican Party. In either case, the Republican Party gets blown up in the short term, but that reshuffles the deck because as we saw in the 1990s with Ross Perot as the competitive third party candidate, the parties just didn't sit there and say, oh, woe is us, Ross Perot's stealing our voters. They figured out what appealed to Ross Perot's voters, picked up on those issues, and realigned those voters mostly into the Republican Party, which is why the Republican Party was able to take over Congress in 1994, 2 years after Ross Perot ran for president. So the Democrats and Republicans will look at the voters that get peeled away in this election, come up with a new mix of issues to appeal to them, and at least in the next election cycle or two, all these things will sort out until we stabilize the parties that look somewhat different in terms of their voting coalitions than what we have had over the last decade.
So Eric, could we do one more quick
Sure.
question?
Are you telling me I need to give a short answer?
No.
I have students who say, when we see you on television, you answer the question in 10 seconds. Why can't you do that in class? And the answer is because they edit me.
The gentleman in front of me almost asked my question, but you are just talking about different parties. And I'm from Germany, and I see the parliamentary system with proportional votes. And one of the things, how do you see that there are more parties coming on, and wouldn't it represent the voters better than this? Because with more parties, they have to do more coalitions and more compromises.
Yeah, we wouldn't have a Tea Party within the Republican Party if we had a proportional election system that allowed Tea Party voters to select their own conservative representatives to Congress. Our system, since it's a winner-take-all system, is not set up very well for third parties to win. So when we have had competitive third parties in the past, voters have temporarily said, well, I hate what's going on so much, I'm willing to, quote unquote, waste my vote on the third party. But that sends a signal to the major parties that, hey, there's this group of voters that are free agents, essentially. So they adapt, they change their issue positions in a way that they can appeal to those blocks of voters, and those voters get pulled back into the two major parties. So through most of our history, the coalitions have been within the Democratic and Republican parties, which is why our parties traditionally haven't acted very coherently, and why our modern polarized parties look a whole lot different than political parties traditionally have in the United States.
The problem is you waste your vote for this little party, you know it will not be there. That's the difference.
Yeah, you don't have a party or a candidate that most precisely matches your policy views. You end up voting for the candidate who's close enough in a party that has a chance of winning in your area. Absolutely.
Well, join me in thanking Eric